This is the Essential Geopolitics podcast from RANE. I'm your host, Emily Donahue. Welcome. Western sanctions that launched after Russian President Vladimir Putin sent Russian troops to invade Ukraine have taken a deep bite out of Russia's economy. Sanctions did not target Russian natural gas exports, and now Russia's demanding that European customers use rubles to pay for gas imports. Why? Well, that's what I'm about to ask Matthew Bay. He's RANE's senior global analyst. Welcome back to the podcast, Matthew.
Thank you, Emily.
What is Russia trying to achieve with this demand?
Right. So Russia's argument is that because the United States, the European Union, and other Western countries have put into place sanctions that are targeting the Russian central bank, Russia's access to foreign currency, and Russia's access to its own foreign reserves that are held outside of Russia, they're basically saying that if you're able to do this, then I want to be able to not transact in dollars when I'm selling my natural gas abroad. So they're looking at, one, trying to find alternatives to accepting euros in this case for the most part. And then two, it's also going to drive demand for the ruble. The ruble, of course, has been shedded as companies are leaving Russia. A lot of investors don't expect the Russian economy to bounce back anytime soon. This has all led to a decline in the value of the ruble. By forcing European customers to pay for gas in rubles, they would essentially be artificially inflating the demand for rubles as these companies try to pay for the natural gas in rubles instead of in euros.
Matthew, how are European governments and companies responding to the demand that payments be made in rubles?
Yeah, so the problem here from Russia's perspective is that in many of the long-term natural gas contracts, the specific way that a payment is handled is going to be explicitly written into the contract. And in many cases, this is written to be euros when we're talking about pipeline natural gas exports to the EU. So from the European perspective, they're making the argument that the contracts have to be respected. There would be if you deny natural gas supplies to any customers that are trying to pay in euros. That would be, a breaking of the contract. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not room for negotiation. Some European companies, they can make the legitimate argument that, well, paying in rubles, which is now, sinking in value, that's actually better for me. It's a cheaper currency. It's not as valuable as the euro. So in some cases, it's actually better for me to pay for it in Russia's currency. However, there are going to be negotiations around this. There are actually negotiations around this issue. For example, from a readout of a call between the German Chancellor and Russian President Putin from March 30th, basically said that there was at least one decision or one mechanism where Russia will be willing to accept dollars, where Russia will be willing to accept euros that are deposited into Gazprom Bank, which is not subject to Western sanctions, or they would be setting up some sort of a ruble euro swap. So there's a lot of negotiations around this. At the end of the day, it's probably going to be a bluff. I mean, earlier in March, Russia had threatened to not pay any of its debt payments in dollars. Instead, would pay them in rubles. But at the end of the day, they actually did it. So ultimately, we might see some sort of a settlement. I don't think that really Russia really wants to cut off natural gas supplies to Europe because it is such an important part of their economy. It's critical for Gazprom. And at the same time, that would also only escalate things further with the West, leading to more sanctions, all of these other things that we've been talking about, on previous podcasts. So I do think there is room for a negotiation. But still, we can't really discount the possibility that these negotiations could fall apart.
Well, what happens if there's no agreement over paying in rubles?
Yeah, so it is possible then that Russia would try to say that if there's no payments at all, well, then that is the European clients, breaking the contract, and they could, withhold natural gas exports to certain parts of Europe and or all of Europe and or, of course, certain specific companies that are, their clients. That could have a drastic impact on natural gas availability within the European Union, causing a knock-on effect to economic growth, etc. When you look at many of the, especially Central and Eastern European countries, a lot of them are very highly dependent on Russian natural gas, and they really don't have a ton of alternatives. For example, Germany, it imports a little bit more than half of its natural gas imports come from Russia. When we talk about Germany's scale overall in terms of the natural gas that it consumes, we're talking about if they can no longer get Russian gas, they would basically be having to replace over the course of a year 50 billion cubic meters of natural gas imports. There's just not a lot of alternatives really when you talk about that scale on the global market. So we are talking about significant escalation of prices. This will drive even more inflation in the European Union. The natural gas price would also increase beyond Europe. LNG prices in Asia would go up, etc. This will continue to drive energy inflation globally, and all the things that come associated with that, whether they be rising fuel prices undermining economic growth, protests among populations that are struggling to make payments on things like gasoline, fuel, etc. Natural gas is, of course, critical for industrial purposes when it comes to power generation in much of the world. That means that electricity prices could also go up, which then has a feedback loop of course, affecting all kinds of goods that are being produced, not just energy, of course. So we are talking about something that could trigger an economic slowdown, particularly in Europe. But coupled with the rising energy prices that we've seen, just connected to the conflict itself, beyond this, it is going to be things that really does exacerbate economic and financial challenges across the world, to be honest.
Matthew Bay is the Senior Global Analyst at RANE. Thank you for that, Matthew.
Thank you, Emily.
His work appears in RANE Worldview. Visit stratfor.com to subscribe. Right now we have a really great subscription price. Learn about it at stratfor.com. I'm Emily Donahue. Thanks for listening.